Welcome to another episode of the Awaken Empowered podcast. I'm Micheila Sheldan. I'm here with Ethann Fox. And on our spiritual quest to evolve and grow, we come across a lot of conflicting information and even some very complex terminology having to do with the workings of the universe. One of those being timelines and dimensions. And there are a lot of people right now talking about the shift that we are making from the third to the fifth dimension. So we thought in a more grounded way, we would break this topic down and really define what we see dimension as and where the earth is going, both from a collective standpoint as well as a more universal perspective of how the earth is interacting with all of the changes that are taking place throughout the universe. And I want to start by saying we had an interesting question come in. I think it was on our last Channeled Revelation show about the earth existing in all 12 dimensions. And absolutely, I want to affirm that we've heard that from the guides many times, that the earth and any planet, any star system is multidimensional, meaning it exists within every single dimension. And even channeling the book, if those of you out there are following along on my website, Epitayam, we learned that the original seeding actually took place in the 12th dimension. So the intergalactic races and beings who came as our original cosmic families, forefathers, mothers, they were 12th dimensional. And so we exist also in all 12 dimensions, and we have that capability within us. And as we've gone through some of the history in the Channeled Revelation shows, we've come across periods of time, obviously, where the earth existed in a higher dimension or certain civilizations were lowered in their dimension. And I want to start by saying I have a simple kind of observation about some of the channelings I've done and what dimension actually means. And I simply see it as an organizational system of the universe, an intelligent universe, actually, that has grown so much and there's been so much created that it's come into this system of informational organization where certain things that exist in the same vibration or have similar characteristics in terms of timelines are all grouped within a certain dimension. So to me, a dimension is simply access to information and similar information or even valuable information that's supportive of what you are creating in that dimension. But I think we get stuck sometimes in the spiritual community judging certain dimensions and making rational kind of observations about what is good or bad about a certain dimension or timeline. And I want to start by saying it is my opinion that the third dimension itself is not a negative place or experience. We obviously all came in as physical, material beings into the third dimension. So we must have been on some quest to better understand it or to have specific experiences here that were warranted both for us individually as well as for the entire planet. However, I think that what gets created within the container of a dimension is up to us. So we have free will to work within the container of a dimension and the level of consciousness and information available to us to create whatever we want. So I think this shift on Earth, moving from the third to the fifth dimension, and the very idea that the third dimension is falling apart, and it really has to in some respects, has less to do with the dimension itself and more to do with what was created there, which actually no longer suits us. And that, I think, merits some discussion.
Yeah, I see dimensions as kind of like a toolbox. I sort of look at it from a very practical perspective. And so the third dimension gives us a set of tools that we're able to work with. And how we use those tools is entirely up to us. But we all have the same tools available to us in this dimension. And the third dimension being a very physical experience, we would tend to use those tools in a very physical way. So, we've talked about this in, I think, previous podcasts and even channel revelations about how, um, the dimension doesn't determine whether or not it's a difficult experience or not. As I've used an example in the past about a gardener, for example, or even a handyman, who might come into this room and they would perceive it as a physical room. They may see the flower of life on the wall and the other art in this room as just physical art. Or a gardener may enjoy playing in the dirt and planting things and watching them grow and breathing in the air and enjoying that physical experience, but they are not really contemplating higher mystical experiences or God beyond a very physical, tangible, religious version of what God might be. So the third dimension really is that set of tools that allows us to have that physical experience in a purely physical way, in a more ego-based way too, where we have that separation from each other, where I'm me and you're you, and we see ourselves as separate from another person. So I think those are some of the tools that we are afforded in this dimension through which we have whatever experience we came here to have. But inside of that, we could have a great experience. We could be somebody who is a gardener or even just living in a normal life, in a normal, average, third-dimensional life, who has a particular work that they do, that they love and they enjoy and they're fulfilled by, and they may go home to a relationship partner, a marriage partner who they love, and children, and create a life there. So their whole life journey is very joyful and fulfilling. I think what we discussed between us before is about how that third dimensional experience got a little derailed. But I would perceive it as that, the having an experience that is purely a physical journey, and where you're able to see, touch, smell the things in this dimension. Obviously, as beings, we came here to the third dimension because we wanted to have that experience. And from various channel revelation shows, the guides have talked about how being in the third dimension is something that's very revered. But of course, many of us come here and we don't want to be here. And I think that's because the third dimension that we perceive has sort of been derailed, as opposed to it could have been a utopia, really, but very physical and very individualized, or rather egocentric, in the sense that we're separate from each other and each having our own personal experience.
Yeah, and I would even take it a bit further in terms of ego, because yes, certainly the guys have talked about, as we move up through dimensions, we have less need to identify separately, even though we're having an individual experience of being a part of a collective. But I think, unfortunately, in the third dimension, our egos have been turned on us. So what the guides say is the ego is so important because we are meant to understand who we are as a unique aspect of a collective. And unfortunately, we're always looking at how we don't fit in or how we don't measure up, and all the things that are wrong with us because we aren't the same, as opposed to revering our differences, which is really, I think, one of the more rewarding aspects of being in the third dimension. The guides say we wanted to slow vibration down to the point where we could savor every material experience. And when you think about that, it truly could be a heaven on earth if we wanted it to. But just like astrology, and we talk about this a lot, being a container for experience, each dimension is a container for us to create timelines and realities. And unfortunately, when you say it's been hijacked, I think one of the biggest factors in that is that hierarchies came into being. So a lot of what the guides talk about in the channeled revelation shows has to do with beings, gods, who took authority and power over us and set this hierarchy up, which in my opinion took us out of the true source field, where we organically source for something that we innately love to do. And we came prepared and trained to offer humanity. So you can see how we've really been pulled out of the true and organic opportunity to build and create a reality and a society that would have thrived in a material sense. But unfortunately, the structures that are there just don't work anymore. So we talk about this a lot, and the guides talk about it's collapsing on itself. It's becoming more and more restrictive. And that's because those pathways to source are so controlled, and they're so opposite of the awakenings that we have all come into in terms of our individual and unique purpose, that we don't fit there anymore. So I think it's important that we are making this shift on Earth out of the third dimension. And it kind of does have to fall apart, not because it's bad, but because what we created there has no longer any relevance or purpose in our ability to expand. And actually, it's kept us in this vicious loop of revisiting history time and time again. So timelines have a lot to do with it. And, you know, to me, a timeline is anywhere you're focusing your creative energy and attention. And the guides say we will walk through multiple timelines in a matter of 24 hours. You know, one day we could exist in various dimensions and different timelines that we're focused in. And that's happens to me all the time. I'm with family over the weekend and can't have these conversations, right? I find myself in a little more of a third dimensional type of reality, or I have to go to the Secretary of State because my driver's license expired. And then I'm channeling, for a group of people on a Zoom call in the late afternoon, which is more of a fifth dimensional timeline. So these are the things that we really have to pay attention to, I think, because the timelines are what construct the dimension. It's kind of like girders on a building. When we're building a skyscraper, all of those girders, the steel walls and bars that come together, is really important to create the foundation and the stability of the building. Imagine if we're trying to build a building with different weighted materials, which is actually what the timelines are. They're different weights and different vibrations. And that's ultimately why we're in such a chaotic experience right now. And it's really hard to get a grasp on where we're going because our foundation is shaking. The building that we've assembled here in the third dimension, it's not stable anymore. So a lot of people ask, on our podcast videos and comments, what do you do? How do you shift and really create a fifth dimensional reality? Well, I think it takes having a level of consciousness that is applied to every timeline that you're in at the time you're there, to really know how to maneuver it in such a way that you're incrementally moving your life towards the dimension or the reality that you want. And it really takes seeing some of those things that exist in the third dimension that are holding you and us as a whole back. And we talk about a lot of those things on our podcast, whether it's taxes or government structure and, all of the rules and regulations and one world government and all of these things. It seems impossible to navigate, but we have to keep in mind that we're the ones creating the timelines. That's just a false matrix that they're overlaying on top of our possibilities such that we perceive it as a requirement and we weave it into our own creative threads and timelines. And that's ultimately what's happened in the third dimension for decades, is that we've been influenced to believe there are certain things we have to do in order to have a job, to make money, to have food, to thrive, to survive. And these are the things we really have to catch ourselves in, because we have to push the envelope on what we're creating in every timeline. And some of that we don't have much control over. So I can't go back to my family and change them. But what I can do is bring my conscious awareness and input to that timeline in such a way that it vibrationally makes an impact. And I think all of us are doing that in our own way. But if we entangle ourselves in all of the things that are going wrong, it's really just going to weigh us down and anchor us in that dimension that we're trying to navigate ourselves out of. So I think it's tricky right now to be able to navigate this shift dimensionally with everything that we have going on.
It's interesting what you were saying about we came here to the third dimension so we could slow down time and savor every moment of it.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, coming from a more mainstream background and being very achievement oriented and focused most of my earlier life, with vision boards and goals and coaches and people trying to help me get to my goals and law of attraction and reading lots of books on success and achievement. Our society is really structured toward getting to that end goal, to, you know, reach that whatever's on our vision board, whether it be money or relationship or something else. We are not trained to experience a journey. So we're kind of missing the point in many respects. So, you know, if we reach our goals, we're happy for a hot second while we reached our goals and we're on to the next goal already. I mean, that's typically how I live my life back, you know, prior to all of this. And I think that's a lot of our society structured that way. Even in the spiritual community, we use vision boards as a new version of that same idea, which is we're unhappy where we are now and we're trying to achieve this thing that's on the vision board or law of attraction. But the whole point being, it's the journey, it's the experience from here to there that matters, right? Because that is the duration, whereas the end result happens in a moment. And I think that's where a lot of us miss out in experiencing that journey. And I think it's really important to focus on the steps, like where you are now in the process of getting somewhere. And maybe that goal will never be reached because it's not part of your soul's journey in this life. And you may work toward it. And certainly a lot of people, myself included, have had goals over their lifetimes or things on their vision board that never actually happened. And because those things are not meant to be for that particular individual, where they may work out for somebody else. But what's missed, though, is the journey from here to there. Even if that journey is a journey that doesn't get you where you think you want to be, the journey is still what we should be savoring, right? The process of getting there. And that's been something that I've had to reframe in my own perspectives in the recent decades, which is that enjoying the process of getting somewhere you think you should be. And then even if you don't get there, it doesn't really matter. Or even if you get there and then it's all taken away from you, it doesn't matter because you still have the journey, the process there, right? Just like I've had many, as we've talked in the previous conversation, I've had many restarts in my life where everything fell apart and I had to start over. And, or even experiences where I went broke and had to start over from zero again. And if you look at that from the conventional mainstream perspective, it's basically failure to failure to failure, right? And but if you look at it from this broader perspective that we're here to experience the journey and savor every moment of it, then those moments of failure are just another moment in that journey. Every period of the journey is progress toward that wherever we're going. And the goal is just simply something that gives us a direction to go. So if we're walking from here to there, the goal is just simply the there that gives us a place to go toward. But every step from here to there is really the point, including that last step where we get to that end result. And that's where I think we missed the point. And, you know, you were talking about a lot of people ask, well, how do I do this? Or how do I change these things? Well, yeah, I think the same thing applies there is everybody is, well, not everybody, but a lot of people, most people are trying to get somewhere other than where they are now, even if that is to get to a better state of peace of mind or happiness or to not be held down by the oppressive system that we live in the world. There's always the there. And I think while the there matters, you know, I think it matters if you're going towards something that you feel drawn to go toward, regardless of whether you ever get there. The process of getting there is what matters. You know, enjoying that process and experiencing the moments and the things that you grow and evolve through. And one of the, I don't know if you said it at our last podcast or if it was something the guide said, but something along the lines of um, ascended masters or the most evolved souls, the thing that they care about the most is learning, learning and evolving and growing, gaining knowledge or wisdom or something like that, I think. So all the other things don't matter as much. When you get to that stage of evolution, expanding yourself is what's most important to them. And I think the experience is the journey through which you can even have that. You can, in the process of getting somewhere. So if your vision board has a car on it or something, that end result, whether you get there or not, the process of getting there changes you. And I think that's the whole point, is you become a different person, even if that goal is not realized. Or if that goal is realized and you move on to the next goal, you're still a different person in that evolutionary journey. And that's where our focus should be, not on how do I change these things so that I can be happy, but rather to find happiness and fulfillment and excitement in every step on the way somewhere, whether we ever reach that destination or not. Because if it's not on your journey, then you're not going to reach that destination anyway. And in my case, that's been true with many things I had on my goals list when I was younger. And some I reached and some I didn't. And the some I reached were good, but then the some I didn't would have also been fulfilling if at that time I had that perspective to enjoy the process of getting there. Even the difficult parts, because even in the difficult parts, if you can be self-aware of what you're feeling and experiencing, it can be just as fulfilling as reaching that goal can be.
That's a great analogy that I think can be applied to what's going on in the spiritual community right now, because there's so much urgency to make this shift and so much talk about, when are we going to see the solar flash and everyone's going to get their big payout and all the white hats and black hats and all of this stuff. And truly, I think the purpose of those in power is to move us out of the present moment, because that is where our power lies. It's where our consciousness grows, because if we can be mindful, even in a physical sense, with wherever we are and whatever we are doing, that's where the next dimension becomes accessible to us, because it's all around us, right? And we talk about spiritual gifts. It's really just the ability to tune into what cannot be seen physically in this room. But you can't do that if you're not in the moment in which you are in the room, right? So I think all of that is so important for people who want to awaken to spiritual gifts, but I think also to facilitate this shift collectively, which is so important to think about as a collective shift, because even though the third dimension could be a heaven on earth, and maybe it was, we're always going to be evolving, right, into the next higher dimension. But it isn't, I think, something that's meant to happen so quickly or overnight, because people want a timeline jump in their suffering. But ultimately, we're meant to cherish all of the new stuff that's coming in and somehow find a logical place for it or a fit for it in the life that we've already created. So we can't just timeline jump. We create bridges, in other words. And I think that's what timeline energy and that analogy of the girders of the building is really so profoundly demonstrates, is that everything that we've created in our lives currently is the foundation for what is coming next. And so we have to get so ingrained in that we expand our consciousness to the degree that higher and higher dimensional information drops in. That's where we get those aha moments, right? And we start breaking the barriers or the boundaries of what we've created before and going somewhere completely different and new. And I think that's where a lot of fear creeps in. And so we get this comment a lot as well. People are afraid. They say, what do you do about the fear? And you and I've talked about it a lot. I think we deal with fear differently. We have different perspectives on it. But, one of the most valuable bits of insight that I had about fear came through Divine Mother. And she was talking about peace. And she said, instead of focusing on peace, what we need to do is stop judging emotions or states of being as good or bad, because we look at fear as negative and we look at bliss as something we want to be in all the time. But the guides say if you were in bliss all the time, you would never expand, you would never evolve, because there's nothing to grow from. That's not really what you want, even though we think we want that. And so Divine Mother says contentment and peace, these are things that we build when we allow a spectrum of emotions. So I think first we have to realize that fear has been so ingrained within us that it's running in the background and we don't even realize we're making decisions through it or from it. Where in the book, the guides talk about very simple things like life insurance and, health insurance and, mortgages and savings accounts. And, these things are the norm, but they really are all manifested from a fear-based mentality. We're going to run out of money, or we're not going to have, be able to pass something on to future generations, or we're going to die tomorrow, right? All of these things are taking us out of the present moment, and we're in constant preparation for what is coming next. But that doesn't allow us to be real with what we feel. So if we're always letting fear move us into the future, we're never going to be true and organic with what's going on now. And we've suppressed that to such a huge level that sometimes I don't even think we know the difference. And we think we're in fear, but we don't even really know what fear is, because we've never allowed ourselves to go to that level, right, of true fear. And I know people out there are going to say, well, it's going to affect my vibration. Why would I do that? To me, because you see how false it is. When you let fear arise and you do what's instinctual in you anyway, or what you're guided towards, you're going to find on the other side how that fear has been so unnaturally cultivated, I think. So I think we have to be kinder with ourselves, and we have to allow our emotions to express, not unconsciously, but just let them work through us and know that it's okay. It's okay to go through periods of uncertainty and discomfort just as much as we want to go through periods of certainty and great comfort and prosperity, because it's how we evolve. But those are stopping points, I think, for us truly on our evolutionary path, and to really take what we are accessing in higher dimensions and put it to use in the dimension we're in now. One of the examples is technology, right? We talk about that a little bit. We see a lot in terms of technological advancement in spiritual modalities and healing technologies and things like this, but they don't really ever come to full fruition. And sometimes they fizzle out, or they don't live up to their expectations. And I don't necessarily think that has to do with the people who are putting them out there. I think it has to do with this kind of low-level fear that the collective is still steeping in, that doesn't allow us to match the consciousness of where these true, creations come from, which is a blending of dimensions, right? It's pushing the envelope on what we expect or what we know to be safe in the third dimension. And that's going to require us to feel a little bit of fear and uncertainty, I think, and to normalize that and say, it's okay. It's okay for us to be afraid of what's coming next or to not know. If we're willing to step into it anyway, I think that's where some of this timeline energy that still needs to move is really going to catapult us as a collective into the next dimension.
One of the things that I realized in my conversations and channel revelations with the guides is that our society is made up of two distinct ancient civilizations, or ancient influences, let's say, the Anunnaki and the reptilians, or the Naga. And we can see the aspects of that in the iconography that exists around the world, that even to this day, and also in society as a whole. We have the Anunnaki, which was the warring, more aggressive, hierarchical system that we still live in today, which is the global banking system and governmental system. Taxes, all of these things came from that time, including shortened lifespans, all of these things. But we also have the Naga or reptilian race, which really influenced everything that we know in mainstream modern spirituality. Meditation or even ideas like Tantra, which predate the reptilians, but nonetheless, those influences have been brought forward into modern society through the reptilian education or their teachings. And so today, as a spiritual community, we default to reptilian teachings when it comes to things, whether that be meditation or stillness or being in the present moment. Those are all reptilian concepts. But and also when we get into a state of fear or any kind of emotional turbulence, our go-to is to avoid that fear and instead meditate, find stillness, go within, but not feel the emotion. And also I find, over the decades of being in the spiritual space, that a lot of people struggle with meditation. We have these stories about Buddha and who meditated under the Bodhi tree for however many years, and we have all these teachings in ancient Buddhism and Hinduism about reaching this state of nirvana or this state of stillness. And yet I find that a lot of people struggle with meditation. There's too many emotions or too many thoughts. You can't still the mind. And we look at these ancient teachers and we judge ourselves based on their perfection in doing these things. But one thing that we never really considered was these were reptilian beings who originated these teachings. And while those teachings are valid, and certainly those are tools we can use, we are not going to be reptilian, although we are more reptilian today than we were thousands of years ago when a lot of these things started, because we've become more and more reptilian as a result of practicing these teachings for millennia. So we may be more reptilian today, but we are not 100% reptilian like many of these reptilians and hybrid reptilians from ancient times who originated and taught these things to the human beings of that time. And so we cannot reach that state of perfection when it comes to mindfulness or that inner state of stillness, which lacks emotion completely. The state of stillness and mindfulness and meditative state that we see described in ancient teachings of Buddhism and Hinduism and other ancient spiritual teachings are based in an emotionless mindfulness, because the reptilians did not experience emotions. But we're human beings. And so we shouldn't strive to do that. But I do think that there are elements of that are good, but it's swung so far to an extreme in modern day spirituality that it's always our go-to. Always our go-to is to go into meditation. And vast majority of people struggle with meditation because we are not designed that way. We're not built to be in that state. But we can use that as one of the tools in our toolbox. So I think where we got a little derailed is we were never encouraged to experience emotions, which is really where our strength comes from. Where the reptilians, it's really more in the mind. And for me, how I experience emotions is I become self-aware of the emotions. So if I'm experiencing, let's say, fear. Now, I think the majority of people, and even when I was younger, experience fear as an external thing that affects them. So, for example, right now you may think, well, the world is in chaos and there's war and all of these threats that are out there that I have no control over. But the problem is, until you become self-aware of your emotions, it becomes something that's out of your control. You actually think you are that emotion. You think you are fear. But the moment you start to notice that you are in a particular emotion, whether it be fear or something else, it becomes a personal observation. So for me, I start thinking about feeling the emotion that I'm feeling, let's say fear. So if I'm feeling fear, I will start going into that fear and seeing, where do I feel that fear in the body? What does it feel like? And really sort of analyze and go into and fully immerse myself in that emotion. And I find that in that way, the emotion becomes something that's just a personal observation, just another, savoring the experience, right? Savoring the journey. It just becomes another part of savoring the journey, something that I'm feeling that is fascinating, that's interesting, that's creating certain sensations in the body. It no longer becomes something that is a negative, but rather just a personal observation and something that I can sort of play with. And then when you take that fear into something you're just playing around with and finding it interesting, looking at it as a soul embodying through this physical structure, then it ceases to become something that controls you. And you actually become the one in control of it. And then you can move on to the next thing. And the fear or whatever emotion moves on and you move on to the next experience. So I think that's where we need to start to shift our perception of emotions, in particular fear, as not something we want to get away from, or not something that we want to meditate away, but rather something that we want to go into and observe and fully experience, because emotions were something that we came here to have and to experience, whereas reptilians did not. And if we're always defaulting to reptilian teachings when we are not reptilian, we're always going to fall short of reaching our fullest potential. Those are tools, certainly, that I think would be beneficial to use at certain times. And I do think some of the reptilian teachings are very beneficial, like being in the present moment or reaching states of stillness. But I think you have to also embody the emotional aspect too. Otherwise, we are constantly moving toward reptilian consciousness and away from what really makes us superhuman in many respects.
I've noticed in the spiritual community, we have a lot of very empathic and emotional people. And there are always questions about that in my community. What's wrong with me? I can't stop crying, or I feel very deeply, and it seems to be a negative. But I think what happens when people do start to meditate is all of those suppressed emotions that, we've been trained in doing since childhood, really start to come up, and we have to process all of that. So I think naturally we become a little more sensitive and raw, and I think that's okay. It's hard to manage, I know, and at times we do need to get a grip on it, but it's all in the perspective. So if we're always looking at ourselves and saying, well, we're too weak because, we're so empathic, or we can't get control of our emotions, we're adding all of this junk on top of, coming into, I think, our own in terms of using the full suite of our creative ability. Because, what the guides say in the book is that, the law of attraction, first of all, I think it's a great example of how something in the toolbox in the third dimension that applied and may have been working and was good to know wasn't the full story. Because as we open our minds to what exists in the fifth dimension and even beyond, naturally, we're going to have new insights about that. And in the book, the guides say our emotional frequencies are the creative drivers of every timeline that we've ever been on, right? So we think we're creating from our thoughts only, but our thoughts are driven by our emotions, and the two work symbiotically, right? So they go, thoughts, emotions, thoughts. If we don't take that into consideration, then we're not going to be creating things that we enjoy or that we really want for the whole of humanity. So I think it's purposeful right now that we're in this emotional time, because not only are we starting to truly feel, the spectrum and capability of our emotional body, but we're learning better how to work with it, right? And how to use it as a tool to move us into the fifth dimension, which I think is necessary. I think for us to be a unified collective, we need to be more empathic. We need to look out for each other. I read a comment the other day, it was on one of our videos, I can't remember, about a woman who is in a spiritual community and was doing quite well as a practitioner, and then fell on hard financial times. And ended up with this stigma and got kicked out of the group because her vibration as someone who wasn't financially successful may have been impacting the financial opportunity of others in the group. And that's such a huge thing I think we're breaking out of right now, is this idea of other people's vibration affecting our own. And I know energy is a thing. That's what we're gaining in the fifth dimension, is this knowledge about our energetic selves and our sensitivities. But think of it this way. If we're just creating boundaries and we're excluding everyone because we're afraid that their vibration is going to lower ours, or their, economic downturn is going to impact our prosperity, then how are we ever going to get to a place of unity consciousness? And we're here to help each other. We're here to lift each other up. So if someone's having an emotional day or exists in a lower vibration than we do, the very idea that we're going to segment ourselves or protect ourselves from them is a reptilian idea. It truly is, because we have to get over this hump of thinking that we're not powerful enough to overcome that stuff. It's the same thing we talked about with dark entities. If we go into this with fear and we think we have to constantly self-protect, we're just going to keep finding ourselves in fear over and over and having to meet that fear in the world. So the whole idea of law of attraction, I think, is changing, at least in my mind. And I really do believe it's a reptilian prophecy because it is so mind-based. And the guides say constantly that our minds are extremely powerful because we did inherit them from the reptilians, but we also inherited a lot of other things that are meant to be working together, in unison. So I think the fifth dimension, it's requiring us to get back into the rhythm and the flow of our birthright in terms of prosperity. And we talked about that a lot in the last podcast with starting over. We find ourselves oftentimes at these junctions, or bridges where things fall apart and we have to let them go and walk over to the other side. And as a collective, we're doing that together right now. So I think that's why it's going to be so important for us to be able to take the fifth dimensional energy, information, wisdom, and put it into some application in our physical lives, even beyond spiritual prophecy, because I think physical embodiment truly is the key to where we're going. And, I know a lot of people don't want to hear that because there are, all kinds of meditation groups out there and manifestation groups. And, I do my own workshops and courses, and those things are great. I think what they do is they get us into the framework or the mindset of present moment and being able to work with our consciousness in such a way that we can be physically embodied and actually make good choices. And there's a fusion between those things. So meditation has its place because it helps us to feel emotion, but not unconsciously use it as an agent of what we do not want to create in the world. And so these things have to be considered. But ultimately, I think the fifth dimension is still a physical place. It is a place that exists already. We know that. Those of you that are out there have already existed in 5D timelines and brought them into your own world. But the mystery and the magic of it, of manifesting instantaneously. Do I think that's possible? Yeah. I also think that we're capped by the possibility of what the collective believes in. And I know some people don't want to hear that either, but if we are meant to be a unified collective, then everything that we create has some connection to something else. And that connection has to have relevance. So everything that we are apt to do is going to influence the creation of something or someone else within our race. And I think we have to keep that in mind, right? Because where we're going, that's one of the most important factors that is missing in the third dimension that seems to be getting worse and worse, is this great divide, between humans and the ego, right? That's been put in the way, and the fight that we're getting lured into constantly. It's really eroding our opportunity to move together very efficiently and support each other as we go in this new direction.
You mentioned some of the individuals in your community are struggling with their emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And see, my thought on that is to, if you're in a particular emotion that is disturbing, to not struggle with it, rather to be in that emotion.
Right.
Because I think in the idea of being in a particular emotion that you don't particularly enjoy and trying to be somewhere else is what builds up the resistance and prevents you from ever getting out of it.
Yeah.
So the more you're trying to not be in fear or stress or distress, the more resistance you're building that will keep you there. And that's why I think a lot of people get stuck in negative emotions and can't move out of it. It's because they are always trying to be somewhere other than where they are. And of course, like I said, a lot of the reptilian teachings in the spiritual community, we want stillness and we want inner peace and to reach these states that the reptilians were able to reach because they don't have emotions, but we're human. And I think the way to get to that stillness is not by trying to get away from what you're feeling, but rather to go into what you're feeling and to feel it as fully as you can. I think the reason is because we were never taught how to be human. Our parents didn't know, and society is structured in such a way that we'll never know. But if we were taught these things at a young age, then I think we would be living in a much more empowered way, where we could experience our emotions and move on. And so in an instance where if you're feeling emotions that are uncomfortable, as I said a minute ago, I think the way out of that is to realize that you came here to savor even that moment. Mm-hmm. And if you're in a moment where you're really struggling with a negative emotion, to reframe that idea as you came here to savor even that. And well, if you can go into that emotion and find appreciation or savor or enjoy or just observe it, rather than convincing yourself that you should be somewhere else. You should be like all the great Instagram photos you see of beautiful people doing fun things that are all very carefully made to make it look that way. That's not, life isn't just that. It is about every moment, even the moments where we're struggling with something. And those moments, if we could turn those into positive things where we're savoring the misery that we're feeling. And in doing that, you're not building the resistance so much that you can't ever get out of it. I think that's why a lot of people get stuck in a negative place for their entire lives or decades or long periods of time, is because they are always trying to get away from it as opposed to going toward it or going into it and observing it and to fully feel it, fully, in a manner of speaking, wallow in it, although wallowing I think is not quite the right word, but rather embracing that moment that you're in and then moving on. I think if you do that, you don't have the resistance, and as intensely as you can feel that emotion, it'll be gone on its own. It will have served its purpose. You will not have intensified it by resisting it, and then you move on to the next experience. So I think that's one of the really important things that we were never taught, that would allow us to step into more of the wholeness of who we are as human beings, but then also be able to reach those states of stillness as well that we've been taught in the reptilian spiritual model, which has its strengths as well. So that's something that I think we could do more practicing on.
Well, if dimension is a container that is full of information, and consciousness is a bandwidth of perspective, then we use our consciousness in order to tune into all of that information. And I think we can apply that to emotion because we're not meant to leave emotion behind. I think emotion comes with us. It just becomes more intelligent because we are so conscious of it that it becomes really valuable information for us. I think emotion can be a guide in terms of what we want to create. So in that way, fear can be a very valuable tool for us because what we're in fear of can guide us to safety, to prosperity, to peace, to whatever we want to create in our lives, but it's not typically seen in that way. And in the fifth dimension, we're also moving into a more multidimensional reality. And I think that's the big difference between the third dimension and the fifth dimension, taking out all the hierarchical stuff aside, right? In the third dimension, we are meant to be more in tune with material in a slower vibration, one thing at a time, right? Where in the fifth dimension, we're managing multiple perspectives and we're working more with energy. And that means we are accomplishing more with less physical effort. And if we get stuck in our emotion, that's going to weigh us down to the point where we're not going to be able to use energy as efficiently, I think, to create. And, we're always using energy, even if we're in the third dimension. I think it's just that when we get into the fifth dimension, we're working more diligently and consciously with energy. And energy and emotion are basically the same thing, right? So in a physical sense, if we're really conscious and aware of how we feel about anything, then we can use that energy to create. And actually, that's what Ascended Master Jesus told us in the last channeled course we just did with the Ascended Masters was, he felt fear, but he was trained at a very early age to use the energy of that fear to hone his teachings, right? To create things in the world that were a part of his mission. And he would never send it out into the world in a negative way because he knew that that energy had to come back. So it would spiral forever and come back around and have to be addressed by someone else, somewhere in the world, somewhere in the universe even. And that's an awareness I think that we're coming into as well. How do we work with not only energy, but emotion? And how do we input that into the world beyond ourselves, beyond our physical reality? Because in unity consciousness, that's going to be extremely important. We still have an ego. We're still focused individually, and we're here to appreciate our differences, while at the same time not using those as the reason for putting roadblocks in the way, I think, of what's ultimately possible, right? So do I think that we're going to move to the ninth dimension, to the 12th dimension here on Earth? Well, those dimensions already exist, but for now, I think the souls that have come here really decided and wanted to be in a more material framework in terms of what we create. And some people may not want that anymore because they think the material world is not serving them. And I think that's what we really have to get out of here to help everyone make this shift together. It's easy to look at the problems of the world and use them as the excuse for why we aren't moving forward. But that's exactly why the problems are put into place, so that we perceive them as something that gets in our way. And that's the difference, right? As we shift in between these dimensions, we're expanding our perception enough to really see those little nuances and things that have been plugged into our reality that falsely hold us back from the truth of who we are and what we're really capable of creating beyond what we've been told. So I think it's inevitable that we're going to get there. And many of us in these conversations already are, right? Existing in a fifth dimensional reality. The question is, how do we bring everyone along with us? And I think that's what's on the top of everyone's mind. How do we interact with those in our reality that don't see what we're seeing, that don't have any consideration about spiritual evolution at all? And again, I think it's the same thing as the roadblocks. We can't put too much attention on that, because the second we do, we're creating it bigger, right? And it's not to say that we shouldn't be somehow encouraging those people. I think we are all here with specific roles, right? Whether that's with family or in your workplace or as a spiritual mentor, there are things that we're here to do that will inspire others or open their minds to, moving in an evolutionary way. But can we force that? I don't think that is possible. And I think there will be people that will remain in the third dimension for the rest of our entire lifetimes. And that's okay too. We talked about that on a previous podcast. There are people out there who are afraid they'll never see family members because they're not advancing as quickly as they are. But dimensions are fluid, right? All 12 dimensions exist in this room. So I could be pulling 12th dimensional information through a channel transmission and still be looking at Ethann at the same time, right? And we exist in the same space. So that will continue on. I think all dimensions overlap. And especially right now, the third and the fifth dimension are overlapping the most here on the earth.
You touched earlier on timelines briefly, and I want to bring sort of a grounded example of that before I talk more about what you're discussing right now. A lot of people may not be aware, but in recent years, there have been researchers all over the world who are finding cities underneath cities. So even in places like New York City, entire towns that are underneath the existing town, that are immediately underneath, and appear to have architecture from the late 1700s, 1800 time period. And yet there is no record of there having been any sort of an apocalypse that occurred at that time. Yet there are these towns and cities and villages all over the world that are suddenly popping up that were buried by some apocalyptic event that occurred in the 1800 period. But there's no such record. And these new buildings that exist there in these locations today were just built there on top of the previous ones, and no one even knew that the previous ones were there. And there's no record of them having been built in the 1800s or 1700s. So what's fascinating about that is we're witnessing two different historical paths that are suddenly coexisting. A historical past that we all remember, which is a past where there was no apocalyptic event in the 1800s, where society just continued to progress forward, and another past where there was something apocalyptic that occurred in the 1800s that essentially buried a good part of the planet, and new civilizations built on top of it again, and we didn't even know it was there. So that is an interesting illustration of timelines. It is showing that there's some sort of timeline collision that occurred in recent years where two different paths collided. And as a result, we can, in the guides, when we talk about the apocalypse from 13,000 years ago, the Great Flood, they talk about how things that are part of nature, like the rocks and the plants and the trees, they make that transition, right? And so we may still find physical remnants of that previous civilization prior to 13,000 years ago, even if a dimensional shift had occurred. So this is a real physical, tangible explanation, right? And yet most conventional researchers are just sweeping it under the rug because they either can't explain it or they don't want to explain it because it introduces the idea of timelines into our reality in a mainstream academic way, which they certainly wouldn't want to admit to. But what we're seeing is the physical reality, the grounded, practical example of timelines colliding, and where two possible futures are now in our past, or rather pasts are in our past now, and one which probably all of us, or maybe most of us, never experienced, but nonetheless did occur on the Earth. And they may have been two timelines that coexisted, but for whatever reason they came together in recent years, and now we're suddenly unearthing events that occurred in that timeline that did not occur in ours. And we talked about this in the Mandela effect years ago, right? But this is a much bigger example of that Mandela effect of different realities having coexisted, and they're starting to come together. And I think we're going to see that in many respects happening in our society in the future. We're going to see a lot of different timelines that may come together. Others may pull apart too. But I think that's a very fascinating observation that we can make today. And we're probably going to see a lot more of these ancient towns, or these towns from 100, 200 years ago being unearthed in the future. And eventually it'll become more commonplace. And I think at what we're sort of maybe witnessing is society starting to move toward the understanding and acceptance of timelines in a more mainstream way. Because at some point, they can't just keep burying these old towns back up again, pretending they don't exist. We're going to have to talk about it. And there's no, they're coming up with lots of very impractical explanations, like all these towns around the world. Their leaders just decided to bury the old towns and build new towns above it and raise the level of the main level of the city. But that's a nice example if it applied to one city and if there was actually a record of that. But we're seeing this as a phenomenon globally that occurred. And not only that, but we're even seeing remnants of different apocalyptic events that occurred even in the time of Rome that there is no record of. There are some Roman cities that were buried because of some apocalyptic event. We don't know what it is. There is no record of something like that having occurred in the time of Rome or since then. And yet all of these cities show signs that there was a tsunami or something that caused them to just all of a sudden be destroyed and buried all at the same time. So what we're witnessing is the coming together of different ancient timelines that were not part of the past that we were living just a few years ago. And it's a real physical, tangible example of timeline collisions and different timelines existing.
I think we're going to see more of that. What's interesting is that the guides say the fifth dimension is a bridge or a doorway into multidimensional reality. And so anytime there's an ancient archaeological discovery, for example, it's not because someone unearthed it, it's because we became the people that matched the timeline or the dimension or the experience that needed to come back into our reality for some purpose, right? Whether it was just wisdom, understanding, or putting it to use, right, in some practical way. So yeah, I definitely think we're going to see more of that as we go forward. And it's really happening in a lot of people's realities. I hear all the time that people don't even remember, it's like their past doesn't even seem like their past. And that is something that I've experienced as well. People in my family even talk about events that we were at together, and I have a completely different understanding of what that was. And the guides say we have to kind of put the puzzle pieces together. So when we move between dimensions, all material, all memories, anything that we created, it becomes transformed because it's going to exist in a higher dimension, in a different speed of vibration. So that's why things become transposed, right? And all of a sudden we reveal things that we didn't know before. So it's an interesting anomaly that's, I think, hard to grasp for a lot of people. I've even seen it happen in my own neighborhood where I've literally from one day to another seen major structures move just a few feet away from where they were before. And I've thought, am I going crazy? I know that wasn't there before. So we're going to notice a lot of that stuff as we go into the fifth dimension.
We were talking about whether we can manifest a 12th dimension in the world we live in today. And I think the important distinction there, as we've talked in channel revelation shows with the guides, is the 12th dimension, well, really from the 7th dimension onward, is less and less ego. So by the time you get to the 12th dimension, you have a collective consciousness that exists on the planet. Of course, all the dimensions are existing on Earth right now, so it's not a matter of creating a 12th dimension. And as you said, you could be channeling a 12th dimensional collective right now into this third dimensional space, but you're not bringing the 12th dimension with you, right? You are connecting to it, bringing forth knowledge and wisdom into the third dimension to be used here with the tools we have available here. But it's not actually bringing the 12th dimension here. Because in order for us to have a 12th dimensional reality in this space, where the whole collective on the planet is walking in the 12th dimension, we would have to be in an ego-free environment, in an ego-free world where we're operating as a collective, where we're not striving for individual things. At which point we wouldn't be putting things on a vision board. We wouldn't be trying to get that perfect relationship or that perfect car or that perfect amount of money or whatever, because those are all ego-driven pursuits. They're all things that you are trying to get for you. Whereas in a collective consciousness, that perception does not exist. So simply the idea or the question of bringing the 12th dimension down to the third dimension is an invalid question in itself, because it's not possible to do. You can't, asking that question would imply that we are existing in the same consciousness. Whereas it's a little bit different in the fifth dimension. We can actually bring the fifth dimension into the third dimension, more so because ego still exists in the fifth dimension, and sixth, and a little bit in the seventh. And so that's why we're able to make that leap to the fifth dimension and manifest fifth dimensional things here. But as you said before, a lot of people attribute negative things to the third dimension, understandably so, because we live in a world where there's hierarchies and people are suffering and struggling, and a few people at the top own everything and control everything. And we've been raised to believe in the spiritual community that that's what third dimension is. And so we want to get away from that, because who wants that except for maybe the people who control everything? And even today, especially the last few years, we've seen that escalating, and we're now heading into a future where it's a very dystopian future where those at the top control even more, and everybody else suffers and struggles even more. And now I think it's important to distinguish that that's not third dimension. I mean, that's what we created of the third dimension, of course, but we could be living in a third dimension that's very utopic, so very physical and still ego focused, but nonetheless a blissful place. A place where maybe we're a gardener, or maybe we are raising children or whatever, but all those physical things are things that we enjoy, and where a hierarchy does not exist that extracts or siphons our power or our wealth or our monetary success, whatever that would look like in that reality. And I believe in a third dimension that is more utopic. We might have indefinite lifespans, or at least lifespans that would, and health spans, to where we wouldn't have disease and suffering and hardship in that way. We would have vitality until the day we're here to leave. So I think that's the one confusion about the third dimension, is that the third dimension means suffering and misery. I don't think it has to be, and I think that's true what you said too, is that it doesn't have to be that. We just happen to have allowed it to become that. And maybe it's not our fault, because we were sort of derailed by reptilian and Anunnaki collectives who came to Earth and created the society where a few control the many, where everyone suffers except for those at the top, who are probably suffering in their own way too. But it never had to be like that. So in order to get to that next place, so I don't think making the leap from third to fifth dimension is practical. I'm a practical person, so I look at things from that practical standpoint. And I think instead, we need to create a better third dimension on our way to the fifth dimension. Otherwise, we're just going to take the same dystopian things that we created in the third dimension into the fifth dimension. So we'll end up with a fifth dimension, and maybe the difference will be we'll all perceive, higher consciousness, and maybe everyone will be a channel, because as you said, the fifth dimension is a bridge to the other dimensions. So we may live in a fifth dimensional reality, maybe much like we live today, right? So there's so many people, or the spiritual community as a whole, let's say, they believe in consciousness and channeling and hands-on healing and all these things. And yet they're all suffering too. And they all pay their taxes, and they all follow the rules, they respect the hierarchies, they vote for their politicians. So they may be accessing fifth dimension, but at the same time dragging all these third dimensional concepts into that fifth dimension. So what will result is we will be living in a fifth dimension. At some point, there will be enough people who are tapping into the fifth dimension to where the whole collective consciousness is moved there. But we may now find ourselves in a fifth dimension where there's still taxes, and there's still suffering, and there's still people starving, and there's still a hierarchy of people who control the world. But maybe in the mainstream news, they'll be talking about consciousness and channeling, and maybe the medical systems will have hands-on healing, but you still have to go and pay for it. You know, you can go get energy healing at the hospital, but it's going to cost you a lot of money to do it, right? Or you still have to pay your taxes, but maybe the taxes are used for more benevolent things than they were in the third dimension. And I think that's where the disconnect is. We have to first start where we are and elevate the third dimension to a higher place. For example, not participating so much in these mainstream things that cause people hardship and suffering, you know, like paying taxes, voting for your politicians and expecting they're going to save us all when they're the ones causing all the problems in the first place. You know, sort of removing ourselves from those fear-based control systems and making better choices in our lives and moving toward things that make us happier, having better relationships and things like that. And then we can take that with us to the fifth dimension, because we can right now have a very utopic sort of world that we live in that third dimension, in which case nobody would want to leave it. You know, I think if we could have created the third dimension differently, we wouldn't be in such a hurry to get to the fifth. Especially now, of course, obviously mainstream society, they don't have these conversations, but in the spiritual community, everybody's talking about getting to the fifth dimension. We're all in a hurry to get there, right? But imagine if we had created a third dimension that was in its most optimal state. I don't think anybody would want to leave the third dimension to go to the fifth, because everything would be great here. And I think that's the misconception, is that third dimension equals suffering and hardship and control and, you know, taxes and money and these things. We just allowed it to become that. And so we, on an individual basis, that doesn't mean that I think we should make picket sign and stand on the corner or show up at the White House or you know, politicians' places where they hide and protest these things. I think on an individual basis, we have to make better choices that move us toward a more empowered third dimensional reality. Yeah, a lot of people, and for as long as I've been following the spiritual community, everybody's been talking about free energy and, you know, advanced technologies for healing and med beds, and none of that can exist in the third dimension in which we live currently. But they could exist. And I think, you know, much like we were talking earlier about how when Edgar Cayce was channeling, nobody knew what channeling was. It was this revolutionary thing, and he was this anomaly. But the fact that he pushed the boundaries or pushed the envelope of that reality in our collective consciousness, it caused a future that we're living in now where so many people are channels. Now, maybe they're not all as good as he was as a channel, but nonetheless, that idea has proliferated into society to where there are a lot of good channels out there. And the concept is mainstream, or at least becoming more mainstream. And I think in a similar way, we have to do that with things like free energy. Free energy was possible a long time ago. Edgar Cayce, but Nikola Tesla had developed free energy technology back then. But it could not come into society because our consciousness as a collective doesn't support it. And we have to move the consciousness to that point, so that other people out there who are working on these technologies will be able to bring those ideas to market. And that is something that on an individual basis, we have to keep pushing the limits of the boundaries of the reality that we live in today. For each person, that may be different. Maybe for one person, it is, you don't pay your taxes or you don't get health insurance because, well, the reality is that if you're meant to suffer or struggle with a particular health issue, it's going to happen anyway. It doesn't matter whether you have health insurance. And in the end, if you're meant to have a financial difficulty because you can't afford your health issues, then that'll still happen even with health insurance. Maybe the insurance company won't pay for whatever it is you're going through. So you can't avoid your experience by, out of fear, choosing a path. Same as paying taxes. You can't expect that by paying your taxes out of fear that you get in trouble if you don't, that's going to avoid the consequences. In these years ahead, as an example, the government is spending so much money that pretty soon they're not going to be able to afford the debt payments on the money that they're printing or borrowing from the Federal Reserve, which means that they're going to have to, at least one of the things they'll do is to try to extract more money from people through taxes. So what happens when everybody who has been paying their taxes and being good citizens, and suddenly the IRS or whatever tax agency in your country wants more? What are people going to do in that reality? Are they going to continue to pay into that? So these are the things that we have to start removing ourselves from, because just staying in it out of the security of feeling like, out of fear, we're going along with and supporting these ideas, that they won't challenge us if it's a challenge we're meant to experience. It doesn't really work like that. So we might as well move towards something that's empowering, that is, that's going to be more fulfilling for us. And if we're developing a free energy technology to bring that idea to fruition, and maybe all that will happen from it is you create something for yourself. Like I've been watching this YouTube channel lately of this guy. I think he's in Russia. I don't know, but he does some very simple, rudimentary free energy technology demonstrations. And all he does is he lights light bulbs with these devices that he just collects a bunch of junk, and he puts his junk together using magnetic fields and coils, and he lights a light bulb up. And it's something anybody can do in 15 minutes, just with ordinary, inexpensive parts. And it's a simple, rudimentary exercise that has very little practical purpose, because you can't exactly power a house with it. But that simple little idea being brought into the collective consciousness, that you can use magnetic fields and coils to light a light bulb. Now imagine if every light bulb in your house was powered that way. Maybe it's not powering your entire house, but that's a revolutionary idea, to be able to never have a power failure where you are without lights, because you can create these simple things that are not going to put the power companies out of business. But much like Edgar Cayce, in a time when channeling was a novel idea, brought that into the collective consciousness. This one individual doing this simple little thing is bringing that idea into the collective consciousness. And in those small ways, we can stretch the boundaries of what the third dimension is capable of producing. And we could live in a third dimensional reality today. Free energy does not have to be fifth dimensional. We have the technology today. I mean, Nikola Tesla was working on free energy. So free energy is not necessarily fifth dimensional. We can produce that. And I think we have to do that in small ways. And in the same way, in every way that we live our lives, we have to start living and moving toward a more self-empowered, decentralized way, where we're not affected by the hierarchies in our society, or the politicians or world leaders who control everything, who determine whether the economy is good or bad, or even we're just talking about daylight savings time, right? How in the United States, politicians decided that there are rudimentary times that of year where we need to adjust our clocks so there's more daylight, which is really to benefit them, so that humanity produces more, but it's not necessarily for the good of humanity itself. And so the little ideas like this, we have to start pushing beyond the boundaries of, so that we can create a third dimension that we all want to live in and don't want to leave. And then as we move into the fifth, and I think actually if we could get to that place in a third dimension where it is a utopia that we don't want to leave, and I think that would be where the collective consciousness as a whole could easily make the leap to a fifth dimension that we also don't want to leave. But the difference being, we may go from a third dimension that's a utopia with free energy and where people are happy and fulfilled and living very physical lives, to a fifth dimension with all the same stuff, but where we're now talking about things like timelines and density and multidimensionality and channeling and things of that nature, or even vibrational healing. So that's where I think we have to move ourselves toward in order to get to a better future, whether it's third or fifth dimensional.
I think the most important consideration as we move from the third to the fifth dimension, or if we just want to improve the third dimension we live in today, is that we have to use our consciousness and our physical decisions symbiotically. They have to move in the same direction. We can't have any contradiction there, because the fifth dimension is really more about using our energy and our consciousness, where the third dimension is those material, concrete, physical creations. And I notice a lot of people very aware, of things that are not good for them, whether it's something that goes in the physical body, like a vaccine or a toxin, or something in, our environment that we may choose as an activity, saying they're going to transmute it through some energetic practice and do it anyway. And I think those are the things we really have to think about as spiritually conscious beings. If we want to move into the fifth dimension, we have to make sure that everything that we're doing, whether it's bodily decisions, monetary decisions, what we're creating for ourselves and our family, are moving in the direction that we want. So that the container that we are creating in and that building that we're forming the girders on is very stable.
Well, that's a good place to wrap it up for today. Thank you all for joining us for another Awaken Empowered podcast. We'll be back next week with another Channel Revelations. In the meantime, you can find us on many platforms, podcast platforms, as well as video channels like Rumble. So we'll see you next week.